When you open the Bible with the eyes of a seeker, not just a believer, you begin to see something extraordinary: hidden patterns, eternal archetypes, and timeless truths that transcend culture and age. Carl Jung often reminded us that the human psyche is coded with symbols, and the scriptures are overflowing with them. But what if I told you that within its pages are not only spiritual blueprints for the soul but also practical revelations for the marketplace? The Bible does not merely talk about prayer and prophesied whispers to us about prosperity, purpose, and provision. It lays out universal laws of human behavior and divine order that govern success. And today, we are going to uncover something fascinating: 4 types of businesses that never fail. These are not fragile ventures built on trends or temporary markets, but enduring archetypes of human exchange and divine wisdom. They are businesses rooted in the rhythms of life, in needs that never go away, and in values that cannot be corrupted by time. And once you see them through this lens, you will understand why empires rise and fall, why economies shift and collapse, yet these 4 remain standing, woven into the very fabric of existence. The business of food and provision stands as one of the oldest and most enduring archetypes of human enterprise, and when we look at it through both a psychological and biblical lens, we begin to understand why it never fails. Food is not merely about eating to survive. It is about communion, about the gathering of people, about the sacred ritual of sustaining life. From the very beginning of the scriptures, food plays a central role. In the Garden of Eden, God placed man among trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food, setting the precedent that provision would always be part of the divine order. When Joseph was given wisdom in Egypt to store grain for 7 years of famine, the very economy of nations revolved around the management of food. In every age and every culture, the act of feeding people has not only kept individuals alive but also created wealth, sustained communities, and preserved entire civilizations. To this day, the exchange of food, the cultivation of crops, the preparation of meals, and the creation of systems to distribute provision remain at the center of every society. The psyche, as Carl Jung would describe it, holds deep symbolic resonance with food. To eat is to assimilate, to take something external and make it part of the self. This is why food carries such psychological and spiritual weight. Bread, wine, water, these are not just substances, they are archetypes. The Lord's Prayer itself contains the petition, "Give us this day our daily bread," which is not only a plea for sustenance, but also an acknowledgement that provision is an unbroken rhythm of life. Businesses built around food will never fail because they are tied to the perpetual rhythm of hunger. Hunger is not optional. It is not subject to cultural shifts or passing fads. People may desire different fashions, seek different technologies, or explore different entertainments, but they will always need bread, they will always need sustenance, and in that constancy, the Bible reveals a principle: the business of food taps into a divine economy that cannot be shaken. If we look at the stories of ancient times, the ones that shape our consciousness, we find food at their core. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of stew, showing us how provision can even outweigh inheritance in a moment of weakness. The Israelites cried for manna in the wilderness, and God fed them with bread from heaven, reminding us that provision is not merely economic but also miraculous. Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes to feed the multitude, demonstrating that abundance in the realm of food is not just a business principle but also a spiritual mystery. Each of these accounts highlights a truth: food is the ultimate bridge between the body and the spirit, between survival and significance. When a business serves food, it is not just selling a product, it is entering into a sacred exchange with humanity's deepest need. Psychologically, food also represents comfort and belonging. Jung would suggest that archetypes tied to nourishment carry the image of the Great Mother, the eternal symbol of care, nurture, and life-giving sustenance. A child's first experience of the world is through feeding, through being nourished by its mother, and this imprint never leaves the psyche. Food is tied to safety, to love, to home. It is no wonder then that restaurants are not just businesses, but places where families celebrate, where friends gather, where lovers connect. Food enterprises are built not only on economics but on emotion, and as long as human beings seek connection, food will be the medium of that exchange. That is why the business of food endures even through wars, recessions, and disasters. When everything else collapses, people will still gather to eat. The biblical narrative further teaches that stewardship of provision determines the strength of nations. When Joseph stored grain, Egypt became the most powerful economy in the world because it held the food supply. Nations rise and fall based on their ability to feed their people. Famines have toppled empires, and harvests have ignited prosperity. To engage in the business of food is to participate in the foundational structure of civilization. Farmers, bakers, cooks, and distributors are not just laborers or entrepreneurs. They are custodians of life itself. The Bible honors those who plant and harvest, recognizing the sacredness of the seed and the soil. In Ecclesiastes, it says that to eat, drink, and enjoy one's labor is a gift from God. Food is thus both work and worship, industry and intimacy. Consider how modern economies mirror these eternal truths. The grocery store is not merely a marketplace, it is a temple of daily life. People come with baskets and leave with provision for their families, repeating rituals as old as time. The farmer's market echoes ancient gatherings where produce was exchanged in the village square. The restaurant is a modern extension of the banquet table described so often in Scripture, where kings and commoners alike shared bread and wine. Even global supply chains and multinational corporations cannot escape the ancient reality. At the core, they are simply trying to meet humanity's most unchanging need. This is why food businesses never fail. They may shift in form from roadside stalls to online deliveries, from family farms to international conglomerates, but their essence remains the same: to feed the hungry. From a Jungian perspective, the archetype of provision is inexhaustible. Symbols around food, bread, wine, milk, honey appear again and again in the collective unconscious. They signify abundance, promise, and life. A business that aligns itself with these archetypes is not merely offering a service but embodying a universal symbol. This is why branding and imagery in food businesses are often filled with symbols of the earth, of nature, of warmth. They appeal to something deep within us that recognizes nourishment not as a luxury but as an eternal truth. The biblical image of the promised land flowing with milk and honey is not only a promise of territory but a promise of abundance, of food security, of life unthreatened by lack. That we also must not forget the moral and spiritual dimension of the food business. The Bible consistently warns against greed and exploitation in the distribution of provision. Farmers are told not to reap to the edges of their fields but to leave some for the poor and the foreigner. The prophets condemn those who cheat with false weights and measures in the selling of grain. Jesus himself declared that feeding the hungry was an act of righteousness, and that in the final judgment, those who gave bread to the starving would be counted as having done it unto him. This adds another layer of permanence to the food business. It is not only practical but ethical, not only commercial but spiritual. Those who engage in it with integrity find not just profit but blessing because they align themselves with divine justice. In times of abundance, food brings joy and celebration. In times of scarcity, it becomes the highest priority. This duality ensures that food will always hold its place at the center of human concern. It is not bound to trends or preferences. While styles of cuisine may change, the act of eating will never disappear. Even when technology advances, when artificial intelligence changes industries, when digital goods replace physical ones, the demand for food remains untouched. No human invention can override the fundamental truth of hunger. The business of provision, therefore, is not just profitable, is indestructible. To grasp the power of this archetype, one need only observe that the Bible closes with the imagery of a great feast. In Revelation, the marriage supper of the Lamb is the culmination of history, a banquet that symbolizes union, celebration, and eternal provision. From Genesis, where man ate in the garden, to Revelation, where humanity dines in eternity. The story of Scripture is framed by food. Businesses that tap into this eternal cycle are not simply selling products, they are participating in the grand narrative of life. The business of healing and wellness stands as another eternal archetype that the Bible reveals, and when viewed through both the lens of human psychology and divine wisdom, its significance becomes undeniable. Healing is not merely about curing diseases or alleviating physical pain. It is about restoring wholeness, harmony, and balance to the human being body, soul, and spirit. From the earliest pages of Scripture, healing is woven into the narrative of God's relationship with humanity. In Exodus, God declares, "I am the Lord who heals you," linking his very identity to the act of restoration. Healing has always been a divine priority, and because of this, any enterprise that centers on wellness will always remain essential. People may avoid luxuries, delay indulgences, or shift preferences, but they will never cease to pursue health. When sickness touches the body, it does not ask for permission, it demands attention. Thus, the business of healing is not optional, It is an unavoidable reality embedded in human existence. Carl Jung would describe healing as a movement toward individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the fragmented parts of the self. This mirrors the biblical view that brokenness requires mending and that life itself is a journey of restoration. Physical illness is often accompanied by psychological and spiritual unrest, and this is why healing carries such universal appeal and necessity. To be well is not simply to have a strong body, it is to experience peace, energy, vitality, and the ability to engage in life fully. That yearning for wellness is hardwired into humanity, making the business of healing an innate domain, whether it manifests as medicine, therapy, holistic practices, or spiritual guidance. The pursuit of wellness will never be obsolete. Throughout Scripture, we see healing as both a divine act and a human responsibility. Naaman's leprosy required obedience to a prophetic instruction. The woman with the issue of blood pressed through the crowd to touch the hem of Jesus' garment. The Good Samaritan poured oil and wine into the wounds of a stranger, showing that compassion and care are the essence of healing. Each of these stories highlights that healing is not only about the restoration of the body but also about the restoration of dignity, faith, and connection. Businesses rooted in this archetype succeed not simply because they sell products or services, but because they meet humanity's most primal fear, the fear of suffering and death. When a person is unwell, they will trade wealth, travel across lands, and endure great lengths just for a chance at healing. This ensures that the business of wellness remains one of the most powerful and enduring enterprises of all time. The psyche is profoundly tied to health. Jung would emphasize that symbols of healing, the water that cleanses, the oil that soothes. The physician's hands resonate with the archetype of the healer, which lives deep in the collective unconscious. Every culture has its healers: shamans, doctors, herbalists, prophets, priests. They hold positions of reverence because they stand at the threshold between suffering and relief. In biblical culture, healing was often considered a sacred act, not separate from worship but part of it. The priests diagnosed leprosy, the prophets declared restoration, and Christ himself embodied the role of the ultimate physician. To heal is to participate in divine work. That is why the business of healing transcends economic cycles. It is not bound by luxury but driven by necessity, reverence, and hope. Consider the economic structures of ancient times. Healing was one of the earliest services exchanged in communities, and even then it was recognized as invaluable. In the book of Luke, we see physicians already established as a class of professionals, suggesting that the business of medicine is as old as civilization itself. The use of bombs, oils, and herbs was common practice, pointing to an ancient system of trade in wellness. The balm of Gilead became so renowned that it turned into a metaphor for healing itself. Even today, businesses that sell remedies, whether pharmaceutical giants or local apothecaries, are participating in that same timeless pattern. They provide hope, relief, and continuity of life, which ensures their survival through every generation. Healing also extends beyond physical ailments, to the mind and soul. Anxiety, depression, grief, and inner turmoil are as real as any physical illness, and they often drive people to seek help. Scripture acknowledges this dimension of healing as well. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, speaks to the reality that emotional and spiritual pain require care. Businesses that focus on therapy, counseling, mental health practices, and spiritual direction are engaging with a form of provision that never loses relevance. As long as humans face loss, fear, or confusion, they will seek those who can help restore balance. And unlike material possessions, the desire for healing is not based on desire alone. It is compelled by suffering. This is why such enterprises endure while others collapse. The moral and ethical dimension of the healing business is also emphasized in the Bible. The prophets condemned those who falsely claimed to heal for profit, or who neglected the needs of the sick. Christ himself overturned the tables of those who exploited others in the temple, showing that healing and care must not be corrupted by greed. This principle still holds. Businesses that pursue wellness with integrity not only thrive financially, but also gain trust and respect, creating legacies that last beyond lifetimes. Hospitals, clinics, therapeutic centers, and ministries that put compassion first often find themselves sustained even in the face of economic downturns, because the public recognizes their service as indispensable. The universality of healing ensures that it remains a cornerstone of civilization. Pandemics, epidemics, plagues, and ordinary illnesses remind humanity repeatedly of its fragility. Each time the world turns its eyes toward the business of healing, seeking solutions, cures, and comfort, no matter how advanced technology becomes, the body will still grow weary, the mind will still struggle, and the soul will still long for restoration. Artificial intelligence may replace labor in many industries, but it cannot eliminate the need for healing. Even the machines of tomorrow will break down and require repair. And so the principle of restoration remains foundational in every form of life and work. Biblically, healing is also tied to faith. Miracles of restoration are central to the ministry of Jesus, who healed the blind, the lame, the deaf, and the leprous. These acts not only brought relief but also demonstrated divine authority, affirming that healing is a testimony of God's power. In the same way, businesses engaged in wellness often carry an almost sacred responsibility. They are not just providing products or services, but acting as stewards of life, bringing people closer to the possibility of wholeness. That spiritual weight explains why healers, doctors, and caretakers are often respected more deeply than any other profession. To heal is to touch eternity. Psychologically, wellness also speaks to the archetype of rebirth. Every recovery is a small resurrection, a reminder that life can begin anew. When a sick body recovers, when a wounded heart finds peace, when a fractured mind regains clarity, it feels like a return to life. This cycle of death and rebirth, of brokenness and restoration, is etched into the unconscious of humanity. That is why healing narratives always resonate. The business of healing survives not just because people need it, but because people are wired to believe in it. Hope itself becomes part of the enterprise, and hope is one currency that never loses its value. In the closing chapters of the Bible, there is a vision of the river of life flowing from the throne of God, with trees whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. From Genesis, where sickness entered through disobedience, to Revelation, where final healing is promised. The arc of Scripture is one of restoration. Healing is not a passing concern, it is the very promise of God's kingdom. This means that any business aligned with the archetype of wellness is not merely functional but prophetic, pointing toward the eternal longing of humanity for wholeness. As long as people are born, as long as they live in bodies subject to frailty, and as long as they encounter pain in mind and spirit, the business of healing will endure. The business of knowledge and teaching is perhaps one of the most overlooked yet profoundly enduring enterprises revealed in the Bible, and when we reflect upon it through the lens of human psychology and the symbolic patterns Carl Jung described, we begin to see why it can never fail. Knowledge is the foundation of civilization, the invisible currency that shapes destinies, sustains nations, and builds legacies. Without knowledge, no society survives, no economy prospers, and no culture advances. From the very beginning of Scripture, the pursuit of wisdom is exalted as a treasure more valuable than gold or silver. Proverbs declares that wisdom is better than rubies and that nothing one can desire compares with her. This establishes the eternal principle that education, learning, and the transmission of knowledge are not temporary needs, but timeless necessities. Teaching is not only about the transfer of information but about the shaping of identity, character, and consciousness. In the biblical worldview, knowledge is always connected with responsibility. Adam and Eve's story revolves around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, illustrating how powerful and transformative knowledge is, capable of altering the course of human existence. From the very beginning, knowledge carried weight. It was not optional, it was pivotal. This is why those who handle knowledge, whether teachers, scribes, prophets, or parents, hold a sacred trust. They are not just sharing facts, they are imparting destiny. Businesses centered on teaching, training, mentorship, publishing, and intellectual guidance have always endured because they tap into this archetype of transformation. Humanity is wired to learn, and as long as generations are born, there will be a need for education. Carl Jung described archetypes as universal patterns lodged in the collective unconscious, and the archetype of the teacher is among the most significant. Every society recognizes the importance of the one who instructs. The sage, the master, the elder who transmits wisdom to the younger. This archetype appears in myths, legends, and sacred texts across cultures, from the ancient Druids to the Greek philosophers, from Confucius to the prophets of Israel. In Scripture, teachers are not just figures of intellectual authority, they are spiritual guides. Moses stood before Israel to give the law. Solomon gathered disciples to impart proverbs. Jesus was called rabbi by his followers. Each of these moments shows that teaching is not simply about academics, but about shaping souls. This archetype explains why teaching has economic, social, and spiritual staying power. It is not a passing service but an eternal necessity. The psychological drive for knowledge ensures that this business never loses relevance. From the earliest stages of childhood, curiosity drives us. A child points, asks, imitates, and absorbs, proving that the hunger for knowledge is as natural as the hunger for food. Just as the body craves sustenance, the mind craves understanding. That craving fuels the existence of schools, universities, apprenticeships, workshops, and now digital platforms. The form may change, but the essence remains the same. The business of imparting and receiving knowledge is woven into human nature. This is why education systems exist in every nation, regardless of wealth, and why even in times of crisis, people invest in learning. When war breaks out, when economies collapse, underground schools continue, libraries are preserved, and knowledge is smuggled across borders, because humanity knows instinctively that to lose knowledge is to lose the future. The Bible consistently affirms the value of knowledge. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, declares Hosea, reminding us that ignorance is not just unfortunate but fatal. Proverbs elevates instruction, saying, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Paul, in his letters, exhorts believers to be transformed by the renewing of their minds, highlighting that spiritual growth is tied to intellectual and moral learning. Each of these passages reveals that knowledge is not optionally, is survival, and where survival is concerned, industries that provide it will never collapse. Teachers, trainers, publishers, and scholars are custodians of the future, and societies that neglect them fall into ruin. Economically, the business of teaching thrives because it has infinite renewal. Every new generation brings with it a fresh demand for knowledge. Children are born into a world they do not understand, and someone must explain it to them. This cycle never ends. Unlike trends that rise and fade, education remains consistent. What is taught may change: new technologies, new discoveries, new languages, but the process of teaching remains indispensable. This gives knowledge-based enterprises a permanence that other industries envy. Universities, for instance, are among the oldest institutions in the world, with some having existed for nearly 1,000 years, and they remain relevant today. Even as industries collapse, learning centers continue because they hold the keys to progress. From a biblical perspective, knowledge also carries an ethical dimension. Those who know have a responsibility to share with those who do not. The book of Deuteronomy emphasizes repeatedly that parents must teach their children the commandments, writing them on their doorposts, talking of them by the way, instilling them into daily life. This principle extends into the economic realm. Businesses that trade in knowledge are not merely commercial but moral institutions. They safeguard memory, transmit tradition, and cultivate wisdom. In this sense, the schoolhouse is as sacred as the sanctuary, because both are places of transformation. This is why societies that invest in teaching flourish, while those that suppress it collapse into decay. Psychologically, knowledge provides security. Jung would say that ignorance is a shadow and unknown that frightens and destabilizes the psyche. To learn is to bring light into darkness, order into chaos. This is why people are willing to pay for education, training, and insight. It is not just about obtaining skills for work, but about alleviating the fear of the unknown. That is why parents sacrifice to send children to school, why professionals spend fortunes on advanced degrees, and why seekers pay for seminars and mentorships. Knowledge brings confidence, security, and empowerment. These psychological needs never disappear, and thus the business of teaching remains unshakable. Consider how the modern world demonstrates the eternal relevance of this principle. Online learning platforms, digital courses, tutoring services, publishing companies, and consulting firms are booming industries because they tap into the same archetype that drove disciples to sit at the feet of their rabbis. Technology may change the delivery system, but it cannot erase the eternal demand. People crave instruction, and those who provide it stand at the center of human progress. Even in remote villages, one teacher can transform an entire community by opening the minds of children to possibilities beyond their borders. This makes teaching not only a business but a force of societal transformation. The Bible also shows that true knowledge is linked with wisdom and understanding, not just information. In Ecclesiastes, the teacher reflects on the vanity of knowledge, without wisdom, reminding us that education must have a higher purpose. Businesses that succeed in this archetype are not those that simply sell information, but those that impart transformation. A tutor who helps a struggling child believe in themselves. a mentor who guides a young professional toward clarity, a preacher who illuminates the truth of Scripture. These figures are successful not just because they deliver facts, but because they bring enlightenment. This is why teaching has emotional and spiritual weight. It transforms the human being, and transformation has eternal value. From Genesis to Revelation, the motif of teaching is ever present. God instructs Adam in the garden, Moses receives the law on Sinai, Solomon imparts wisdom to seekers, prophets admonish and guide, and Christ spends his ministry teaching parables and lessons. The Great Commission itself is centered on teaching. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you. This shows that teaching is not an auxiliary task, but the very heartbeat of the divine mission. If God himself operates in the realm of teaching, then surely the business of knowledge will remain essential as long as humanity exists. Even the closing imagery of Scripture is educational. Revelation reveals mysteries, unveils hidden truths, and provides insight into eternity. This reminds us that the final gift of God to humanity is knowledge, revelation, and understanding of his plan. Teaching is not only temporal but eternal, not only practical but prophetic. That is why this archetype never fails. It is bound to the deepest human longing for truth, clarity, and direction. As long as humanity seeks to know, the business of knowledge will thrive. The business of clothing and shelter is one of the most fundamental and enduring enterprises revealed in Scripture. And when viewed through both the biblical perspective and the symbolic lens of Carl Jung, we can see why it stands among those that never fail. Clothing and shelter are not luxuries. They are necessities woven into the very fabric of human existence. From the very beginning of the Bible, both appear as central elements in the human story. When Adam and Eve fell in the garden, their immediate awareness was of their nakedness, and God himself clothed them with garments of skin, establishing that covering the human body was both a practical and spiritual act. Shelter, too, is foundational. Noah's Ark provided protection from the flood. Israel dwelled in tents during their wilderness journey, and God promised his people houses and cities in the land of promise. The themes of covering and dwelling run like threads throughout the Scriptures, reminding us that human beings will always need protection from exposure, from the elements, and from the vulnerabilities of life. Businesses that provide these basic needs participate in an eternal pattern of provision that cannot collapse because it rests on something that no human being can do without. Jung would describe clothing and shelter as archetypal symbols connected to safety, identity, and the human relationship with the outer world. Clothing represents not only protection from the environment but also the covering of vulnerability and the expression of identity. Shelter represents the archetype of the home, the sacred space where one is safe, grounded, and shielded from chaos. Both speak to the universal need for security and belonging, and both are deeply embedded in the collective unconscious. This explains why every culture in history, regardless of wealth or technology, has developed systems for clothing and housing. The forms may vary, whether skins, fabrics, or high fashion in the case of clothing, or tents, huts, skyscrapers, and mansions in the case of shelter, but the need itself is permanent and universal. This permanence is what makes clothing and shelter among the most stable and enduring businesses in human history. Biblically, clothing is often tied to dignity and identity. Joseph's coat of many colors was not just a garment, it symbolized favor and distinction. The prodigal son was clothed in the best robe upon his return, symbolizing restoration of honor. Priests were dressed in holy garments for glory and beauty, setting them apart for sacred service. In each of these examples, clothing was more than material, it carried spiritual meaning. To clothe someone was to cover their shame, affirm their worth, or elevate their status. This is why the business of clothing never fails. It does not simply sell fabric. It fulfills a human and spiritual need for dignity, belonging, and self-expression. Even in the most difficult economic times, people continue to buy clothing because it is not only functional but tied to identity and social life. Shelter carries a similar depth of meaning. To have a home is more than to have walls and a roof. It is to have a sanctuary, a place of safety. In Scripture, the promise of a dwelling place is often tied to blessing. God told Israel that they would inhabit houses they did not build and live securely in the land. Jesus spoke of going to prepare a place for his disciples, tying the idea of shelter to eternal hope. The Psalms describe God as a refuge and fortress, likening his presence to the ultimate shelter. All of this underscores that shelter is not simply a physical need but a spiritual longing for protection, stability, and belonging. Businesses that provide housing, builders, landlords, developers, and even those who craft temporary shelter are tapping into one of the most profound and enduring human needs. Psychologically, both clothing and shelter are linked to survival, and the reduction of fear. To be exposed, whether physically or socially, is to feel vulnerable, and humans instinctively seek covering and protection. Jung might say that the home is a symbol of the self, the structured inner world, projected, outward clothing, likewise, is the outer covering of the self, the persona through which one interacts with society. These archetypes mean that no matter how advanced technology becomes, no matter what social changes occur, people will always invest in their clothing and homes. It is not optional. It is fundamental to human existence. This makes the business of clothing and shelter recession-proof in a way few other industries are. Consider how deeply these industries are embedded in the global economy. Fashion is not merely an industry. It is one of the largest cultural and economic forces in the world, constantly renewing itself but never disappearing. People may shift preferences, but the demand remains constant. Even in the poorest communities, clothing is valued, traded, and sought after. Similarly, real estate and housing represent some of the most stable investments globally, with property markets continuing to endure even in volatile times. People may lose luxuries, but they will fight to keep their homes. This underscores the biblical truth that businesses meeting these needs are aligned with divine patterns that cannot fail. The Bible also links clothing and shelter to compassion and righteousness. In Isaiah, God condemns those who fail to clothe the naked. In the teachings of Jesus, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked are seen as acts done unto him. Job defends his righteousness by saying that he provided for those without clothing. These passages elevate clothing and shelter beyond business into sacred duty. Enterprises that serve in these areas are not merely economic ventures, they participate in the work of justice and mercy. This adds to their permanence, because they are sustained not only by demand but by divine approval when pursued with integrity. Clothing and shelter are also tied to celebration and transformation. In biblical narratives, new garments are given during times of victory, restoration, or covenant. Zechariah describes the high priest being clothed in clean garments as a symbol of forgiveness and renewal. Revelation speaks of the saints clothed in white robes, symbolizing purity and eternal victory. In the same way, a home is more than a dwelling. It is a place where families are built, where generations are raised, where memories are made. Weddings, births, and celebrations are tied to homes and garments, showing that these needs are present not only in survival but in joy. Businesses in these areas thus thrive in both times of hardship and times of abundance, because they are tied to every stage of human existence. Psychologically, clothing also fulfills the human desire for identity and self-expression. Jung described the persona as the mask or image one presents to the world, and clothing is often the tangible expression of that persona. Fashion and style give people a sense of control over how they are perceived, a way to align their inner self with their outer appearance. This makes clothing more than a necessity. It becomes an expression of individuality. As long as humans seek identity and belonging, clothing will remain a powerful and profitable enterprise. Likewise, the home expresses personality, stability, and social status. A house is not only a shelter but a projection of the self, a physical manifestation of security and identity. This explains why people continually invest in decorating, upgrading, or personalizing their homes. The psychological pull is too strong to ever vanish. Even when societies change, when wars and disasters strike, the first instinct is to rebuild homes and provide clothing. Relief efforts around the world focus immediately on shelter and garments, because these are inseparable from human dignity. This underscores that the business of clothing and shelter will never collapse. It may change forms, it may evolve, but it will always exist. From ancient tents to modern apartments, from simple woven garments to designer fashion. These businesses remain permanent because they respond to needs that cannot be erased. From a biblical perspective, clothing and shelter also point to deeper, spiritual realities. God clothes his people in garments of righteousness and covers them under his wings as a refuge. He provides eternal dwelling places, a heavenly home not made with hands. These promises show that clothing and shelter are not merely material needs, but symbols of spiritual truths. Businesses that participate in these industries, therefore, resonate with archetypes that stretch from earthly necessity to eternal promise. That is why they endure through centuries, unaffected by passing trends or economic collapse. They are not only industries, they are reflections of divine order.